Thank you, Julia. Kia ora tātou. Great to be back on the coast. It's a while since I've been here. I love it here. And for a book I did called Castles of Gold, I was over here 7 weeks in a row. I stayed with you at one stage. And I used to have this old car that I called the Beast. It was 1986 Honda. That's only a few years ago, so I finally upgraded. And it was fantastic because it was really powerful going up all the hills. And then when it came to turning the corners and going down, everyone caught up with me again. This is like trying to steer a ship. So it's great to be here. The other thing I thought of, just when Len was talking, he mentioned the marathon. And I have to, one of the few things I can claim to have done is to run that marathon. The year it was from Greymouth to Hokitika, so it was downhill. That year. And what I couldn't believe about you guys is the prizes. The first 15, so you need to get in the first 15 and you got a prize. And lo and behold, the bloke who got last got as big a prize as the person who got first, which I think was absolutely fantastic. So wonderful. Well, I'm going to talk to the first of a couple today on women. So we haven't heard much about women so far, have we? A little bit, here and there, but not much. I'm going to start this off. Sandra Quick, who's over here. Quickie is going to talk about women hotel keepers. And then, Julia, you've got some women in your stuff around intimate histories and bigamy and marriage and so on. So I'm kind of like the opening act for these guys, and they're going to come in and kill it after me. So I'm going to talk about women's working lives. And not surprisingly, given that I do mainly on the coast, I've done mainly Irish stuff. I'm going to use Irish examples, so I make no apologies for that at all. But I wanted to pick up on a couple of things that have been said so far, and I was going to say this anyway, and both Carol and Len have mentioned Phil May's work. And when Len was talking and he mentioned that last passage of the West Coast Gold Rushes, and I have to say to you guys, and I've said it before to audiences, and I think of all the books in New Zealand history, and I've only read some of them, I admit, but that would have to be my favourite book, the West Coast Gold Rushes. I just think it's unparalleled. To me, it's like Kerouac's On the Road, but with a better ending. You know? It's just like an amphetamine rush from beginning to end. You know, to written a narrative like that captures just a few years and all those pages, and it's a kind of book you can't put down. I think it's a great achievement. But one of the things, well, there's two things I'm going to say to you that set up what I'm going to say about a woman. And the first was the bit that Len mentioned at the end, that very powerful passage, which is almost spiritual in a way, suggesting there are ghosts in the landscape, or stories in the landscape that need to be uncovered. And I found that very powerful and very inspirational. And he's talking about Liverpool Bill and Jimmy the Slogger and so on. And the same goes for those of us trying to do women's history on the coast, trying to get to those stories. And the other aspect which Carol has touched on and what she was talking about, that book was written in, 1962 then, wasn't it? And you mentioned now, we talk about transnational, so historians would stand up here and they'd say, we need to take account of connections between different parts of the world. What's amazing about the West Coast Gold Rushes is that it really was, long before those kinds of words were bandied about among historians, it was a truly transnational history. And for me, the bit that Carol quoted about Hokitika being an outlying suburb of Melbourne is a really key one. You know, because when you think, and I get goosebumps just in this hall, thinking that right next to us here, along the quays where all the shipping came in, and it was packed with, we saw it with, anyone who went to Julia's book launch last night, saw one of the slides, all those ships that were dotted along there. And I just think how busy it must have been. And then I thought, well, one of the key things is where did most of those ships come from? Yes, some came from Dunedin and some came from Nelson, but most of them were coming over here from Melbourne and they were coming over here from Sydney. And Carol also mentioned about shopping, because, and this is actually important, it's not a trivial thing at all, it's actually really significant because while Len mentions the word transnational, more recently historians have started talking about mobilities rather than migration. You may yawn, another piece of jargon, do we really need it? But I think it's interesting because over the last 10 or so years, by talking about mobilities, historians have drawn attention to not just people moving, but the stuff that goes backwards and forwards. And that might be paper, might be material goods. And I think of a story when one of my informants, who died a few years ago, here on the coast. When I say informants, a mate of mine who was over here used to take me around different places and show me different things, who lived in New Brighton and Christchurch. He was a coaster, born and bred. And he showed me a bed in his house and some clothes. And these related to a woman by somebody you will have heard of by the name of Sarah Gillan, who lived at Kamaka. His husband was Patrick Gillan. And I was quite excited. Here's a bed that had been in Kamaka in the 1860s, and here's some clothes in the same period, which are looking a bit worse for wear. And I was thinking that with a museum eye, gee, we need something done with these textiles. But I was told that these are things she had gone to Melbourne to buy. This was the marital bed. These are clothes she had bought. So just as we go on Jetstar now, so we shoot over the hill, go to Christchurch. No, I won't say Jetstar because you'll be waiting for the plane may never go. Right? So bad choice. Just as we get on Air New Zealand now, whip over to the Gold Coast for a holiday, or go over to Melbourne, and we do go shopping. Similarly, people then thought nothing of getting in ships and shooting across and doing shopping, which raises a very important point, because we often think of the sea as a barrier to folks back in the Goldrush days. The sea was actually the bridge. It was never a barrier to folks. And they were able to zip backwards and forwards with very little difficulty. The land was more of a barrier. As we've heard today, people were talking about how on earth did they make their way down the beaches and all through these different places. The sea was a highway through which people went backwards and forwards. So the point I want to make to you is that one about, to understand the gold rushes here and Otago, in fact, to understand New Zealand migration history at all, you have to take into account that trans-Tasman flow. And we know it. So many of you will have relatives over in Australia now, right? So many Kiwis do. We've got family there, transnational families. We've got folks over there who always shoot over there for holidays. For many of the women then that I want to look at, most of them who came here to the West Coast came from Melbourne in particular. That was the port they came from. So whereas many of the men came through Otago and then to the coast, when we look at many of the women who came here, regardless of nationality, they came via Melbourne, some via Sydney. That's where most came from when they came here in those days. And what that means is that these are people, and again, Len and Carol have alluded to this, these are people who, or women who, when they came here, had been around for a wee while. They knew what it was like to live in a colony. They'd been living in Victoria, some had been living in Otago. They knew how a colony worked. Even if they'd come from some little place in County Kilkenny or the south of England originally, they'd spent time elsewhere before they ever got to the coast. So a couple of points I want to make at this stage. So I've said, look, it's inspirational what Phil May said about trying to uncover the lives of people in the past. How do we do it for women? Because it is very difficult. It's really easy to find stuff around your wayward woman, Julia. Right? They're woven right through the record. Why is that? Because, he says as he takes off the jacket, wayward women. The thing about wayward women is they may not have left diaries and letters, but their words are scattered through the newspapers. So if you're addicted like I am often to papers past, and when I introduce my students to it, they get really excited, and I can't get them on task. They just want to look at crime and all this other stuff that's going on. But they're relatively easy to find, and it still excites people. I remember getting flown over to Aberdeen, Scotland, to give a tour. And there were a bunch of mainly male historians. And the minute I mentioned some of the names of some of the, we call them now sex workers, prostitutes, nymphs of the pave back in the day. And I got to Porpoise Mary, and they were away. All they wanted to talk about was how Porpoise Mary got a name and so on. But there are others that, you can see I'm quite excited about this too. But there's another one I think of, Mary Rice, Tipperary Mary, and there's on the road into Newtown, Town, wee spot there where she had a garden, a house and a garden. And again, I think of the stuff, the mobility of things that are brought with people. And you have all these terrible stories about Tipperary Mary, and yet she had a garden that had Peruvian lilies in it. And some of those Peruvian lilies at this time of the year just started to come out. And if you go to the No Town Cemetery, there are a couple of people I know on the coast here who have planted some of those Peruvian lilies in the No Town Cemetery. So we know a lot about those people in Overland Kate and Leaky Liz. I don't speculate on how she got a name. So we know a lot about those people. But we know far less about other women. And there are a number of reasons for this, most of you know of anyway. So it's really trying to take what materials we have and read them against the grain a little bit to try and say something about what women's lives were like. So among the women that I was looking at and their working lives, who are mainly Irish, it took a couple of years just to work out where they were from, going through death certificates, coming over here and annoying Mary in the museum and going through all the cemetery records and linking those into probates and really doing family history on a much larger scale, if that makes sense to you. It's like doing your genealogy, doing your family history, but doing it for hundreds of women at a time and trying to get something about their lives and their careers in records that are not really that promising. And it took me a long time just to get to the point where I could say something about where these women came from in Ireland. And not surprisingly, given they come from Victoria, they came from pretty much the same places as Irish people in Victoria are from, which is to say places like Tipperary, Clare and Limerick. If you go into any of the cemeteries around, you see this on the stones, right? Won't surprise anyone. And Munster and Galway and Kings and Kilkenny. And then going further than that, I found that most of them came from this is the thing, you think about Irish people, for example, you think that, they'd be from very poor backgrounds and the famine, and you play violin, it's all terrible. But in fact, these people came from really well-to-do backgrounds, and relatively speaking, in an Irish context. So they were literate. They had to leave because they didn't get a dowry, so they had to go somewhere else overseas. And then going further from that, what was very striking is that when you teased out these hundreds of family histories, what you found is that these women didn't come out here alone. They didn't just jump on a boat, land up in Melbourne, work there for a while, and then come to the coast. They were connected to cousins, and it's very difficult to do the whakapapa, which is probably the wrong word for this, but you know what I mean. They were connected to cousins. They came out with brothers or sisters. They travelled to the west coast following brothers or with sisters, or they were the pioneer and others followed them. So they weren't women alone, in the majority of cases coming out here to the coast. And when we look at the kinds of work that they would have done in Melbourne, most of you can guess this, what do you reckon they did in Melbourne? Young single Irish woman, what are you doing? Exactly. So they work as domestics over there. And I suppose I was so naive when I first came to do this work on the coast. I used to have these ideas, romantic ideas about the coast, the Wild West, etc., etc. And then you suddenly realise that there was a hell of a demand for domestic servants over here on the coast. And I went to the house of Daniel Shady, who ran the Brian Baru and Greymouth. Went to this house which is still standing there and saw the servants' quarters out the back, and it cemented for me how important women's work was in terms of domestic service here on the coast. So most of those women who came out here, and a large proportion of them, whether they were Irish or not Irish, were married before they ever got here. So they married in Victoria or married in Otago and then come here. So that's about half. The rest, most of them, would have come out here and worked as domestic servants, housemates, not as dancing girls. Right? They came out here. And so women are here, whether married or unmarried, doing the kinds of things that men struggle to do for themselves. Washing and cleaning. You know this. Most of you probably experienced this. So let me give you a couple of stories, a couple of illustrations. We heard about at the book launch, the Moynihan's, and I had a number of people who contacted me a few years ago to talk about the Moynihan family story. And I just wanted to share one little story. Catherine Moynihan came from County Clare. She goes to Sydney, not to Melbourne, in 1863 on the Spitfire, and she's accompanied by two brothers, Patrick and Sylvester. But her departure there is part of a much bigger movement of people from Kilcraden to New South Wales that began in the 1850s and goes through to the 1870s, and she's kind of in the middle of all that. And she was reunited there with four of her older siblings, an older sister and three older brothers, and then joined by a younger brother and heaps of other rallies as well. She works as a domestic servant in Sydney, and then she comes across here to Hokitika with four of her brothers in the 1860s. And it's pretty likely they lived with Patrick, who was one of her older brothers, and his wife is also born in Kilcraden, Nora White, as soon as they got here. She marries Patrick Dunn at Ross in 1874, and then this is a typical pattern. People don't always stay here. I know we love the coast, but people don't stay here. They travel on. Hence the whole thing about mobility is being important. People don't stay necessarily. And she goes back, that Trans-Tasman Highway, goes with her husband to Kyabram in Victoria. And there, Sandra, they open a pub. So she becomes one of your women hotel keepers, but in Victoria. And I share that story because it just shows how mobile women were. We tend to think, oh, women, you're wearing those long dresses and they sort of stay put and guys go and do all sorts of exciting stuff. That wasn't the case at all. These were tough women. They were extremely mobile. They were well connected. They were moving hither and thither around our part of the world, through Australasia and often further abroad as well. And what that little story also highlights is how important those family networks were in terms of structuring the migration flow of people to this part of the world, and that families span the Tasman Sea in both directions, just as they do today. And we have family abroad and so on. So these women are a mobile workforce, really, especially the young single ones who are moving and from here to there, especially around the coast, taking up work. And the lovely thing is about the coast, as in Melbourne, there's an insatiable demand for domestic servants. So if you don't like somewhere, and there are lots of cases of this that I came across, you just move to another employer. You get good wages. You don't like someone, they're ripping you off, you get out of there, and if you've got brothers, you get them to go and sort the guy out, and you move somewhere else. And I went through lots of the marriage records to see what sorts of jobs people had. And yes, of course, domestic servants are there, but when you look at the other kinds of jobs that women were doing, it's really, really interesting. There were people working in dressmaking. There were people working in laundries and everything else. And once they were married, so much of what happens on the goldfields here is based on the paid and unpaid contributions of women. So if you think of some of the sorts of things, once you have children, you think of the cleaning, think of the child rearing, think of the education, think of all the other things that women would have done. It must have been a pretty tough life. And we heard, I think, the other night at the book launch, something about someone having, 18 live births over a period of about 18 years. You're going to be, if you're a woman at that time, you think of someone like Tasha's just about falling asleep there. But, someone of her age, if she was married on the coast at that time, would have been likely pregnant through till she was in her 40s. So think about that, and then think about doing this work as well. And we think, gee, they have big families, wow, 12 or 13 live births, and often there were more than that. And now, you have some of you guys say it was tough doing two. I might get out of here alive. The final one I just wanted to share with you was a woman that I fell in love with, and I've often said it's very odd to fall in love with people who did. I don't know what that says about me. Maybe I should be taken up to see you, I don't know. But there was a woman there's a woman who's been mentioned today. Paul, you mentioned her, Ellen Pearcey, right? It was Ellen Walsh, who ran the Helvetia Hotel up at Goldsborough. And I fell in love with this woman because she wrote her a number of letters. She wrote lots of letters to different parts of the world. But the ones that have survived, oddly enough, are not the ones she sent to Australia, not the ones she sent back to Ireland, but the ones she sent to California. And what's amazing about her is that there's something about the way she talks in her writing. It sounds like her speech. She spells phonetical. And she's always apologising for being a bad writer. And yet somehow she gets across, manages to communicate with different parts of the world. And I just found it amazing that someone who could be widowed in the 1870s when her husband, who's Swiss-Italian, has a strangulated hernia, and she's left as a widow, yet she still runs a big hotel. Not only that, as you said, she goes and opens a big new one, up your way. So, here's a woman who did these incredible things. And, this will get me lynched. This will get me lynched. I just wanted to share, as a final thing, a couple of the things she says, you see. And she's giving advice to her sister-in-law, who marries her brother-in-law, Victor. And this just beautiful the way she writes, and we've split it up and transcribed it, but as I say, she spells phonetically. So this is her advice. I take the liberty of saying a few words to you. Love your husband as you love your own flesh. Respect him 10 times better than yourself. Obey him in everything he tell you to do, no matter what he tell you to do, for he knows best. There's more, but wait. I know there's some guys in the audience who can't believe this. I think, has he really got a death wish? I'm going to go through it. Be kind to him and rejoice at his footstep coming home to you, for it is sweet voice is like a bell to your ear. She talked, you can see my iPhone like. So Alan Piercy, who worked as a domestic servant, became one of your hotel keepers, and probably you're going to talk about her, are you?
I thought you went something.
Oh, you've left her out because you thought I would. Yeah. Oh, okay. That's fine. Okay, just to finish off then. I can't imagine the goldfields without women. A lot of historians now in Australia and New Zealand are doing much more work more broadly. So we've got the miners that we've always had there from Phil May's time right through to the present. Those stories are still being told. But we've got a lot of other stories that are getting told as well about the gold rushes. I mean, Julia, you did your wonderful piece on Chinese here, which is absolutely tremendous book. In Australia, there are a number of historians now who are starting to look at those trans-Tasman connections, because for years they just ignored us. That trans-Tasman thing didn't figure in histories of gold and digging in Australia until relatively recently. And you've got people over there like Claire Wright, who wrote an amazing book. Here's a good book, good tip for you, a book called The Forgotten Rebels of Eureka, which won the People's Choice Award at Book Awards in Australia this year. There are people like that who are doing digging histories now, who are trying to retrieve all these different histories. And I suppose for those of us who are interested in women's history, like myself, we're part of that, trying to retrieve as many stories, as many the diverse stories, I suppose, of the goldfields. And this particular piece is a companion to one I did in a book called Deeper Leads, which was edited by Keir Reeves on men. So I've been doing all this women's history, and I thought, gee, I should do something on blokes. So I did that, and then no one thought like me for a while, so I thought, so this piece is going to be a book that Lloyd is editing, and I'm helping him out a little bit, getting in his way, and running interference and so on. But the book's called Rushing for Gold, and all going well, Lloyd, it'll be out next year, is that right? And this is the only West Coast chapter in the book. And all the money goes to a good cause, doesn't it, for the book?
Yeah, well, it certainly doesn't go into us.
Yeah, it doesn't go to us. So
we will do a launch over here.
We will do a launch over here, so look forward to seeing you at that, and thanks very much.